We continue our coverage of the news of the passing of the long-serving former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. 95-year-old Mugabe died in hospital in Singapore. For the latest, we now cross to the SABC news correspondent in Harare, Ephert Musekiwa, for news on the ground. Ephert, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on the Globe.
Good evening, Lulu. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Ephert. Ephert, what's the mood like waking up to such sad news of the passing of the founding father and former president of Zimbabwe? What's the reaction been on the ground?
Well, early in the morning when Zimbabweans received the news of the passing on of former President Mugabe, there was a lot of disbelief. I remember speaking to people early in the morning, they were just saying, it's one of those hoax on social media and, until they'd gotten confirmation from credible sources or from authorities, only then would they believe actually in the passing of the former president. But as the day progressed and as the news kept coming, even as state media started confirming that he had indeed passed on, people began to express disbelief. Some were saying they've lost a trusted leader. So it really, the feeling was varied. The expressions were varied. We've spoken to a lot of Zimbabweans. We've spoken to politicians. We've spoken to even later this evening, President Mnangagwa made an official statement where he has said that the ZANU-PF party has declared former President Robert Mugabe a national hero, and that he has also declared days of mourning, that the nation is mourning until the day that the former president will be buried.
Now, speaking of the day that the former president will be buried, at any stage, are there any news with regards to when he will be returned to the country?
Well, when President Mnangagwa addressed the media this evening, he did not indicate as to when he will be, when former President Robert Mugabe's body will be returned to Zimbabwe, but he did indicate that they are working on modalities to make sure that the body is repatriated, but did not give any indications of timelines. He also indicated that the funeral arrangements up until the former president's body is in Zimbabwe, only then will they get to indicate when the burial arrangements or where the former president will actually be buried. All he did indicate was that he has been declared a national hero, and that automatically means you will get a state funded funeral and nothing more beyond that.
There's been continued tributes coming in and condolence messages from various parts of the world, African leaders, the Kenyan president declaring that flies must be flown at half mast, and messages of condolences from Russia's President Vladimir Putin, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. That reaction from global leaders and continental leaders, what does it really say, and how are the people of Zimbabwe reacting to those messages? And the sort of speaking of the person that former President Robert Mugabe was.
Well, like most people that we spoke to, even those that did not support President Mugabe at the end, still hold him in high respect. That also includes even the opposition, the current opposition leader, who said that he admired former President Robert Mugabe, and that the works and all the things that the good things that the former president did, no one is able to take it away from him. Yes, people do make mistakes, and yes, former President Mugabe made his mistakes, but according to the words of most people that we managed to speak to, is that they still respect the good that he did for the country, the tireless efforts that he did to liberate both Zimbabwe and Africa, the work even post-independence, where he was always vocal and fighting injustice, fighting inequality at every fora, at the United Nations, at the African Union, everywhere he went. So really people do hold former President Robert Mugabe in very high respect, but it's just that towards the end of his career, they believe that he made quite a lot of mistakes, which actually led to his ultimate downfall.
Now, what are the people of Zimbabwe speaking of with regards to, things or for instance, the land issue where they own land? What are they speaking of or referring to what they have achieved in the time of President Robert Mugabe and the difference between his leadership and the current government of President Emerson Mnangagwa?
Well, when we asked people what legacy Robert Mugabe has left, one of the things that they spoke about is the education, and the second thing was the land. It was consistent everywhere we were asking. People talk about the education, people talk about the land, and they are very proud to own the land. They are saying that the majority of the Africans or the majority of the black people in Zimbabwe actually own the land. Whether they are productive or not is another debate for another day, but they are proud for the mere fact that they are able to own that which God has bestowed upon the people of Zimbabwe. As to the difference in leadership, a lot of people that we speak to, mostly opposition or people that are not in support of ZANU-PF, believe that it is still the same system because, as you recall, Emerson Mnangagwa was Robert Mugabe's right-hand man for quite a long time. So they're saying that the systems or the style of leadership has really not changed. Even when you speak to academics, they say the same thing, that the style of leadership has not changed. So it is the same, or it is a continuation of Robert Mugabe. Actually, in the words of Nelson Chamisa, he says, "We have changed the rider, but we have not changed the ride." So really, people believe that it is a continuation of some of the policies that Robert Mugabe left, that the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa, is continuing with.
Now, there was a tweet very early this morning before the news of the passing of former President Robert Mugabe was confirmed by Jonathan Moyo, where he said that a dark cloud had just come over Zimbabwe.
Yes, indeed, I did see that tweet early in the morning, and it's true that when you speak to people, whether people supported Robert Mugabe or they did not support him, you still get a sense of loss when you speak to them. People are saying we've lost a leader. Agree with him or not, he was a principled man. So any death is not, it's nothing that you celebrate. You actually feel the loss, and I think it is true that there is a dark cloud over that's hanging over Zimbabwe. And also, I think from what Professor Jonathan Moyo is also indicating is that people were hoping that the rift between the current president and former President Robert Mugabe would have been resolved before he passed on, because now that he has passed on, if that rift had not been resolved, no one really knows if the old wounds, especially of how the power changed hands between the two, and it's uncertain times. We are not sure if the family will allow the current president to preside over the funeral, or to actually give a speech, or even to attend the funeral. So really, there's a lot of uncertainty going forward as to what is going to happen in the next few days when the body is repatriated back to Zimbabwe and the funeral proceedings continue. So really, we wait to see how the family is going to take it, or how the family is going to treat and respond to current President Emerson Mnangagwa's presence at the funeral.
Now, Ephert, there are reports of former President, the late President Robert Mugabe, stating a few months ago, that he did not want to be buried at the Heroes Acre in Zimbabwe, but rather he wants to be buried in his home village where he was born, next to his mother. Have those reports been confirmed?
Well, there hasn't been any confirmation, but the debate on the streets when that report came out, there was a lot of arguments. People were saying that, there are people that are buried at the Heroes Acre where we've been buried there against their will, and why should former President Robert Mugabe be an exception? And there are also others who are saying that we should respect the wishes of the dead, but we haven't gotten the actual confirmation from the family. I think we will only get to hear once the family comes, or once the body has arrived in Zimbabwe, when the family actually gets to put the position across. Right now, you'll understand that most of them, that is the Grace and the children, are currently in Singapore. They were with him during his last moments because of his illness. They'd actually had to travel and be next to him. So really, we haven't gotten any concrete position from the family or anyone who would actually confirm those reports about President Mugabe saying he did not want to be buried at the Heroes Acre.
Ephert, thank you so much for your time. That was SABC News correspondent in Harare, Ephert Musekiwa, joining us via Skype. Tanzania's President John